Well, welcome everybody. Today, many people are celebrating Easter Sunday, some referring to it as Resurrection Sunday, because we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ, of course, and there's many great teachings about the resurrection of Jesus. And I don't really want to repeat those because they actually cover different aspects. They show details from different perspectives, kind of like the four Gospels records show details from different perspectives. Today, I am going to provide an added perspective, and we'll be focusing more closely onto an event that ties very closely to the resurrection and that I see as highly relevant, the Feast of First Fruits. I don't know if you've all heard of that one before, but that's what we're going to be focusing on today. When reading the Gospels, because they all focus on the life of Jesus, it's easy to get a little tangled up and even to suspect there might be contradictions. Although, rest assured, God is the author, never contradicts himself. That said, I want to start with two verses from different Gospels. The first is in the book of John, in chapter 20 and verse 17. And the context is Mary from Magdala, also known as Mary Magdalene, where she was in the garden where the empty tomb was discovered. And Peter and the other disciple, having seen that, left, but Mary was still there. And Jesus appeared to her, and she thought he was the gardener at first, but once he spoke her name, she realized it was Jesus. So here we are in John chapter 20, verse 17, and it says, Jesus says to her, "Do not touch me, for I have not yet gone up to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am going up to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." So this is pretty clear, don't touch me. But later we see in Luke chapter 24, where Jesus says, and so we'll be in Luke chapter 24, verse 39, "Look at my hands and my feet, and see that it is I myself. Touch me and see, because the spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." So here he actually tells his disciples to touch him. So it seems like this is a contradiction, but I'm going to show you that it's really not. Note that when it comes to the two Greek words, it is true that different words are used. In John with Mary, it's the Greek word haptomai, which implies grasping onto, or like giving a hug to, or throwing yourself around, something in that range. You know, you might pounce on something. In Luke, it's the Greek word salafao, which is more like when you run your fingers and look at something, when you examine it to verify its characteristics and quality, like when you're shopping and you pick up a piece of fruit and you want to make sure it's ripe or what stage of ripeness it's in, or, you know, any other kind of thing that you're really examining with your hands to determine its characteristics and quality. Both are very consistent with physical handling though. So why the difference? The big clues actually appear much earlier in your Bible. I'm going to take you back to the Old Testament. So first, let's go to Exodus chapter 12, and we'll start in verse 1. So Exodus kind of leads back to when the children of Israel were in Egypt, and that Moses is going to lead them out of there. So Exodus 12, starting in verse 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month will be the beginning of months for you. It will be the first month of the year for you." So note that this is the month of Nisan, also known as the month of Abib. Those both stand for the same month, two different names, I think different languages. Previously, the month of Tishri was the beginning of the year. God just shifted the religious calendar by 6 months right there. The secular calendar stayed the same. So you may notice that when, really exploring the Old Testament, that sometimes you have to pay attention to whether the event is secular or whether it's religious to know which calendar you're on, because they'd shift by 6 months. So I'm going to continue in verse 3. "Speak to all the congregation of Israel and say, on the 10th day of this month," so this is a time marker, very clear, "every man among them must take a lamb according to their father's house. a lamb for a household. And if a household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor next to his house are to take one according to the number of the souls. According to what everyone can eat, you are to make your count for the lamb. Your lamb must be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you are to keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will kill it at evening. So we've got the 10th of the month and the 14th of the month. So far, that's what we're learning here, but there's more. So continuing on in verse 15, we'll jump ahead to 15. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you must put away yeast out of your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that soul must be cut off from Israel. On the first day, there will be to you a holy assembly, and in the 7th day, a holy assembly. No kind of work is to be done in them, except what every man must eat. Only that may be done by you. So I want to point out these holy assemblies. They're kind of like, Sabbath days, that in some places, though any of these holy assemblies, might be called Sabbaths, because really a Sabbath is a holy assembly. It's just you're going to have these additional holy assemblies. Like if you have this feast day, whatever day it happens, it may not be on your weekly Sabbath. It may be a different day during the week. So you could have more than one Sabbath during the week because of these holy assemblies. So continuing on to verse 17. You are to observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this same day I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore, you must observe this day throughout your generations as an ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you are to eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. There must be no yeast found in your houses for 7 days. For whoever eats what is leavened, that soul must be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a foreigner or one who is born in the land. You will eat nothing leavened in all your habitations. You must eat unleavened bread. So here we see that the Feast of Unleavened Bread started the same day as the Passover and lasted 7 days. And the first and the last days were considered holy assemblies or Sabbaths. So for the background, God instructed Israel to have these memorial feasts. And there were a total of 7 of them, at least initially, 3 in the spring, 1 in the summer, and 3 in the fall. And both the 3 spring feasts and the 3 fall feasts were closely lumped together. They were kind of in a cluster, very, very close to each other. And just like the Gospels, when you read any one of them alone, you are getting part of the story. It's in looking at all 4, it becomes more clear what actually happened. Without all 4, it's easy to form a bias that can result in error. And there's more references to these feasts in the Old Testament. But from an instructional perspective, I see Leviticus as being able to give us some real relevant help. So now I'm going to go over to Leviticus chapter 23. And in so in Leviticus chapter 23, I'll start us off in verse 4. So Leviticus 3:24, these are the appointed times of Yahweh, holy assemblies. Yahweh is, by the way, the real name of God. Like God is a title like king, whereas Caesar might be the actual person's name who is the king. So Yahweh is God's actual name. And it appears a lot in the Old Testament, and the Jews were concerned about saying it. So a lot of times they just put Lord, but in the actual real text, it's his name, Yahweh, although we're not 100% sure how it's pronounced because they'd never pronounce it. These are the appointed times of Yahweh, holy assemblies that you are to proclaim in their appointed times. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, between the 2 evenings, is Yahweh's Passover. Now, these 2 evenings had to do with the Jewish reckoning, how they considered time, and it sort of brackets the time frame as being roughly between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. Like 3 p.m. was evening, but then 6 p.m. was more like sunset. That was really, the end of the evening. But both of those, it kind of, all of that cluster, that whole period of time was considered evening, and that between the evenings gave you that full time period. Continuing in verse 6, on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to Yahweh. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. So here it kind of clarifies. Now the Jewish calendar, they started their days in the evening time. So the unleavened bread actually, like kind of started, right after the Passover. In the first day, you are to have a holy assembly. You are to do no customary work. We saw that earlier. But you are to offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh 7 days. In the seventh day is a holy assembly. You must do no customary work. So this suggests you kill the Passover lamb on the 14th in this bracket of time. And remember, evening was the start of the new day. And on the next morning, the 15th started the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which went for 7 days. So we're continuing with Leviticus 23:9. And it says, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when you have come into the land that I give you and you reap its harvest, then you must bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And he will wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted for you. On the next day, after the Sabbath, the priest is to wave it. So one thing I want to point out here, and I may be restating this, but it's like this Sabbath could be, a high day Sabbath. It could be the regular weekly Sabbath. But if your harvest becomes, ripe, your harvest is good on regular Joe Tuesday, you can't, just bring in your wave offering that next morning. You have to wait until you have a Sabbath day. Then after the Sabbath day, then you have it delivered to the high priest. Then after that Sabbath, that next morning, the high priest can bring it into the Holy of Holies and wave it before Yahweh. And when Yahweh accepts it, then that requirement is completed. And so that's kind of the game changer there. So on the day when you wave the sheaf, that would be the priest, you are to offer a male lamb without blemish, a year old. We had that before, without blemish, year old, for a burnt offering to Yahweh. The grain offering with it is to be 2/10 parts of an ephah of fine flour mingled with oil, an offering made by fire to Yahweh for a pleasant aroma. And the drink offering with it will be of wine, the 4th part of a hin. The thing about fire is it utterly destroys things. You must eat neither bread nor roasted grain nor fresh grain until this same day. So your harvest may be ripe and you may have grain that's ready to eat, but you do not eat that grain until the priest completes his requirement. You just hold tight, live on what you had from last year. You are not touching this new harvest until the priest completes his work by waving this offering in front of Yahweh. Until you have, until you have brought the approach offering of your God. This is a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. So let's go through this a bit slower. Leviticus 23:10. Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when you have come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, then you must bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. There were 2 main harvests in Israel, the barley harvest, which was in the spring, and the wheat harvest, which was closer to the fall. In both cases, as it first became ripe, you take your best sheaf of the harvest to the high priest. Remember, he's talking to Moses. This is in the context of the Levitical law. Continuing in verse 11, and he will wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted for you. On the next day after the Sabbath, the priest is to wave it. Now, this isn't necessarily a high Sabbath. It can be a weekly Sabbath. Who knows when this grain will be ripe anyway? This feast is anchored on the harvest being ripe. Oops. Just got to get back here. There we go. So you wait for the grain to be ready. You take a nice ripe sheaf, you bring it to the high priest. He waves it in the temple before God. Now we jump to verse 14. You must eat neither bread nor roasted grain nor fresh grain until this same day, until you have brought the reproach offering of your God. This is a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. Note the until here. Once the priest performs his duty, the requirement is met. But until that is done, no one in all Israel is to have any of the harvest. I just want to restate that. And this is to go on year after year. So Leviticus 2 has more information about this grain offering. There's quite a lot in here, but I'm going to share what I see as most relevant. When anyone approaches with an approach offering of a grain offering to Yahweh, his approach offering must be a fine flour. He's to pour oil on it, put frankincense on it. He's to bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and he will take his handful of its fine flour and its oil and all its frankincense. And the priest will burn this reminder portion into smoke on the altar, an offering made by fire of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. So frankincense, when it's burned, it would provide a lot of smoke to where visibility would be greatly limited. So continuing in verse 4, when you approach with an approach offering that is a grain offering baked in the oven, it must be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. If your approach offering is a grain offering from the griddle, it must be of unleavened fine flour mixed with oil. So leaven was associated with sin. And you'll see this in a lot of places in the Old Testament and other, even in the New Testament. There's a correlation that's shown in many places in the Bible. And I'm not going to go deeper into that today, but it's important to note that this offering was to be sinless, that was the focus, get the sin out, that leaven was associated with sin. And in verse 9, the priest will take from the grain offering its reminder portion and will burn it into smoke on the altar, an offering made by fire of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. So here's one more thing about the fire. There's examples that show that God's providing the fire was his acceptance of the sacrifice. Probably the most clear and vivid example that comes to mind for me is in 1 Kings in chapter 18, verses 20 through 41. And we won't go there now, but it's the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal and how they each had a bull and built an altar and slaughtered the bull. And the prophets of Baal called on their God and called and called and called, danced around, did all these things to have their God come and burn the sacrifice they put on the altar. Nothing happened. Then Elijah makes his preparations, has his altar, puts the bull on there, and douses it with water, a lot of water. Again, 3 times he had people dump water on this thing. It was just soaked. He called on Yahweh, his God, our God, and bam, big fire, burnt bull, water all gone. It was very, very powerful. It's a great story, but it makes it very clear that this fire is what shows God's acceptance. So we're going to continue in Leviticus chapter 2 and in verse 13. Every approach offering that is your grain offering, you are to season with salt. You must not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your approach offerings, you are to offer salt. So salt represents the covenant and the commitment that goes with it. And there's a lot of information about salt covenants and how strong they are, how binding they are. But it also points to a right and a sincere heart. There were times when Israel got to the point where they were just going through the motions. And God didn't even want their sacrifices. If you read Amos chapter 5, verse 22, you'll see that God didn't want their sacrifices if the heart wasn't right, that this salt shows this right heart. So getting back to our earlier verses now, I'm going to tie this together. Told you we'd get back there. Let's take another look at it. John 20, verse 17 again. Jesus says to her, Do not touch me, for I have not yet gone up to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am going up to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God. So what's going on here? You notice the word up. If we look at Exodus chapter 34, verses 22 through 24 are going to help shed some light. So in verse 22, it says, you are to observe the Feast of Weeks with the first fruits of the wheat harvest and the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end. 3 times in the year, all your males are to appear before the Lord Yahweh, the God of Israel. For I will drive out nations before you and enlarge your borders. Neither will any man desire your land when you go up to appear before Yahweh your God 3 times in the year. So the temple at Jerusalem is at the top of a hill. So to go there, you have to go up. When Jesus was talking to Mary, he was letting her know that he was going to the temple. By now, I'm hoping you will see the parallels to Jesus. The frankincense, the obscured vision. The high priest could not see God when he went into the Holy of Holies to meet God. And after Jesus was risen, the men from Emmaus in Luke 24 didn't recognize him right away. And Mary thought he was the gardener until he spoke her name. He was absolutely the one and only sinless person. His heart was so right, seasoned with salt, and God accepted him as the first fruits. And nobody could touch the first fruits until after he was presented at the temple. Jesus got up from the dead, and his focus the next morning at the time of the first fruits, he would have had his eye on the prize. I'm going to go to the temple. I'm going to present myself as the first fruits. And after God accepts me as the first one who's ever been raised from the dead, then he will accept the whole rest of the harvest, because that's how it worked. Once that sheaf was waved by the high priest and it was accepted by God, then the whole harvest was available for all Israel, for everyone. I can't imagine what it was like for Jesus. He was well aware of the feasts of Israel. He was aware he was the Passover lamb. He knew that he got the sin out with unleavened bread, and when he got up from the dead, he was the first person to ever be raised from the dead. Once up, he knew as the first fruits, he was to be presented to Yahweh, our God, before anyone else could partake of the harvest, which was him. So nobody could touch him until after he was presented. He had never been in the Holy of Holies before, ever in his life. This was the place that the high priest could present himself before God, and only the high priest was allowed in. And Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, not Levi. So there was no chance of him ever getting in there. However, he was appointed a priest by God himself after the order of Melchizedek. There's a lot of validation of this in Hebrews, especially in chapter 7, and that's kind of like a whole other teaching. The point is, this was really a big deal. He did the work. Now he was going to be able to meet God in the Holy of Holies. He was going to be able to go in the inner part of the temple. No one else was to partake of what he accomplished until he was presented to God as the first fruits. But once that was completed, everyone was then able to partake of what he accomplished. Don't touch me until I am presented to God. Then and only then, it is okay to touch me. So there's no contradiction at all. When Mary from Magdala first saw him, he hadn't gone to the temple to present himself as the first fruits. After he did that, later in the day, it was okay for others to touch him and see that it was real. It was him. God had promised that people could get up from the dead. He was the first one, and it really happened. A new spiritually empowered body. I would so have loved to be one of the disciples. And in Galilee, there was like 500 people that saw him to see what that body was like. Now, there's one more thing I find interesting. Remember, the Feast of First Fruits was the morning after the Sabbath. The grain would be ready when it's ready. First grain would be ripe on the day it was ripe, not a day before. And Israel had been doing this ever since God instructed them to. If say the grain became ripe on a Monday, they would have to wait until the next Sabbath, which could be 6 days away. Then the next morning have their feast of first fruits. And ripe or not, no one's having any of it till the priest present it in the temple of God. On any given year, it could go through the variation of this: wait 6 days, wait 5 days, wait 4 days. You get the picture. All of the timing of all of the feasts this particular year fell with such perfection. So I want to share a chart and explain this a little bit more, what the point that I'm trying to make. So let me share that. And here we go. Bam. Can you see this little table in front of you? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Yep, I see a couple nods. Okay, so what I have here is think of this as like a calendar. You got Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. These are the days of the week, right? And that in Israel, it gets a little trickier for us to get the hang of it, but they started their days in the evening. So do you remember back in Exodus, it said, select your lamb on the 10th. On the 10th day of this month, you are to select the lamb. The 10th of Nisan in that particular year would have fell on a Saturday, which just coincidentally would have been a weekly Sabbath, which is fine. The 10th is the 10th. We're going to do it whether we have a Sabbath or not. And that the selection of the lamb is part of the Passover instruction. So we're already in the season of Passover, so to speak, although it's not the Passover feast day. This is just the selection, but this is part of the instructions. We're going to start on the 10th by selecting the lamb, and now you're in the season. Like if you think about Christmas as a holiday season, you might have a Christmas party a week before the actual Christmas Day celebration, that you're in the season of it. And when you hit the 10th, you're in the season, and you start off by selecting the lamb. And that on this particular day, I'm pretty sure that this was the day. It doesn't really anchor it so much in the scriptures, but from a time perspective, it seems, pretty likely that this would have been the day that he entered into Jerusalem. Remember the crowds hailing and laying palms in his path and selecting him, Hosanna. And if you look at Matthew 21, verses 1 through 11, Mark 11, verses 1 through 11, Luke chapter 19, verses 28 through 44, John chapter 12, verses 12 through 19, that they all kind of cover this event of him coming into Jerusalem. And in John in particular, part of the end verse says, the Pharisees said among themselves, you see that you are not accomplishing anything. Look, the world has gone after him. So that right there shows very much a selection. The world has gone after him. So on the 10th, we have the selection. Okay, the 11th would have been a Sunday. Nothing really happening there. Monday would have been the day of the Last Supper. And that, so when he said, get ready to prepare the Passover, they're already in that season of Passover. So it's not a contradiction there. It wasn't the Passover feast, but they're in the season of Passover. It's like they're having an event like in there. And this would have actually been more of a regular thing anyway, other than the fact that there's a lot of detail, especially in the book of John. There's like 5 chapters or 8 chapters where, it talks about the things that he talked to his disciples about during this Last Supper. It was like so critical. This was going to be the last chance he had to meet with them and impart to them all of the things that they would need to do to carry on when he was gone, because he knows he'd be dead, and from the grave, you can't do anything. And so on the 12th in the evening, it was the start of the 13th. This is when Jesus was actually arrested. And all 4 Gospels cover this arrest. So this was on a Monday. Matthew 26, 47 to 56 covers it. Mark 14, verses 43 to 52. Luke chapter 22, verses 47 to 53, and John 18, verses 2 to 12. So all of them have information about the arrest, but the whole Last Supper thing is like just amazing. I'll show you something after that shows how cool that was. But so he gets arrested in the evening, and that there's a lot of details that I'm not going to spend as much time on today. But the next day, at daybreak, they started to have like a fake trial for him. They send him over to Pilate. They send him over to Herod. He goes back to Pilate. Pilate's really struggling with it. He finally caves in and sends him over to the guards, who would have beat him like all night long. So there was a lot going on this Tuesday, even though I don't have a lot of it, but there are a lot of scriptures that covered it. Was, there was a lot going on that day. Then the next day was the 14th of Nisan, which was the Wednesday, and that was the Passover. So remember, on the 14th of Nisan in the evening, you're going to kill this lamb. That's the Passover. And so in Exodus 12:6, if you remember me reading Exodus 12, keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will kill it at evening. And so in the Gospel of Mark, it shows that he was let out at like 9 in the morning. They crucified him. First they crucified him and 2 others. Then they brought up 2 others with him. They put the inscription over his head. They cast lots for the garments. He's talking to, the other people that got crucified with him. All these different things, are happening from 9 in the morning until evening time, which would have been closer to like 3 in the afternoon. And his crucifixion and death happened at evening time of the Passover. As the Passover lamb was being killed, that's when Jesus Christ gave up his last breath. That's when he died, at the same time as this Passover lamb. So then you have day 1 of his being dead goes to Thursday. So from evening to evening, that's day 1 on Thursday. Day 2 would have been Friday. So here's day 2 of him being dead. Then day 3 of him being dead, because remember, it said 3 days and 3 nights that he would be dead. So that brings it to Saturday, which is the weekly Sabbath. So he would have gotten up at evening on this Saturday, because I'm sure God didn't have him in the ground 1 second longer than he needed to, got him up after he met the requirements. And the very next morning, guess what? Because this is a weekly Sabbath, when he got up, the very next morning, he gets to present himself as the first fruits. He didn't have to wait 6 days. He didn't have to wait 5 days. He didn't have to wait 4 days. The very next morning after he got up, he was going to get to go immediately to go see his father. When I saw this on the calendar, I was way pumped up that this is so cool. It's like God couldn't wait to see him, and he couldn't wait to see God. This was going to be their first time. I used to think that maybe when he rose from the dead, that God would have been in the tomb there for him. No, that's not how it goes. It's the Feast of First Fruits, and that they would have waited, delayed gratification, to see each other until this moment. This was huge. So the remaining days of unleavened bread, just happened after that. So anyway, there's more detail of this. As a matter, I'll talk about that a little bit after, but I just wanted you to see this chart about how incredible this timing was. So let me get back to here. So I think it's so awesome that God orchestrated the timing of that specific year so that the events would take place the way they did, with that perfect timing, so that Jesus would have fulfilled his requirement of being dead 3 days and 3 nights, and the very next morning get to fulfill his first fruits presentation as the priest in the Holy of Holies. He didn't have to wait even a full day. And about this resurrected spirit-powered body that Jesus got, we're going to get one of those. He did it. He met all the requirements. He did everything that was needed. He was the first fruits of mankind, and he presented himself, and he was accepted. And now we, as members of mankind, when we believe on him, we are also part of that accepted harvest. And this is mentioned several times in the church epistles. In Romans chapter 8:23, it says, and not only that, but we ourselves also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves keep groaning within ourselves, eagerly awaiting for our adoption, the redemption of our body. That's right. We don't have everything Jesus accomplished for us at this point, but we do have part of it. And part of it is the gift of Holy Spirit that God empowered Jesus to give to every person who believed on him. We're the first people, the people who live in this time period from the day of Pentecost till Jesus returns, that get this new in quality kind of spirit that no one ever had before. And we get it in connection with Jesus, who's the first fruit. Romans chapter 11, verse 16 says, now if the piece offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump of dough. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. So that's right. Jesus was accepted by God. And because of him, we're accepted too. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20, it says, but in fact, Jesus has risen, raised out from among the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So that's right. He died. And unless his return happens first, we're going to die too. But he got raised. And because of him, we will too. This is also stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 23. So 1 Corinthians 15:23 says, but each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then those who are Christ's at his coming. And in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, it says, but we are obligated to give thanks to God always for you, brothers and sisters, loved by the Lord, because God chose you as the first fruits for salvation through holiness produced by the Spirit and belief in the truth. He called you to this through our good news, so you can obtain the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. Are you seeing the pattern here? The book of James, chapter 1, verse 18 says, by his own will, he gave birth to us by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits of what he has created. It's always been about Jesus. God had the plan, and the plan was Jesus. And if we trust God and believe his word, he supports the plan in so many ways. The whole Bible is about Jesus. And when he was successful in meeting the requirements, it was a game changer. It changed everything for all of us. Let's face it, death stinks. There's nothing good about it. Yet it lays in wait for all of us, except for one thing, God's plan, Jesus our Savior. And when we believe in him, we are part of the harvest where he is the first fruit. He was raised to a new spiritual body, and we will get one too. So my final verse I'm going to cover, our section, is also in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And I'm going to read verses 42 through 49. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a soul body. It is raised a spiritual body. Since there is a soul body, there is also a spiritual one. So also it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam has become a life-giving spirit. But the spiritual is not first. On the contrary, the soul body is. After that is the spiritual. The first man is of the earth, made of dust. The second man is of heaven. Like the one made of dust, so too are those who are of the dust. And like the heavenly man, so too will be the heavenly ones. And just as we have borne the image of the man made of dust, we will also bear the image of the heavenly man. I can't imagine what it was like for Jesus, the first person to ever be raised from the dead in a new spiritual body. People recognized him. They could touch him. He could eat. He ate fish. We're going to have bodies just like that. And in that new body, he was focused on presenting himself to God. And because of him, there will absolutely be a day when we also, just because we see him as that Savior, the Son of God, that God raised from the dead, we too will get those new bodies. And I can't wait. Thanks for being here.